Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into a fascinating, honestly pretty unorthodox worldview drawn from a collection of some seriously intense analytical texts. These sources present a radical claim that the modern English language isn't just evolving, it's actually actively decaying our minds, and along with it, our capacity for objective truth. It's a heady premise, I know. The authors of our source material ask us to consider something wild. What if the language you speak is actually an invisible cage? According to these texts, modern English has basically been engineered to trap the mind, slowly replacing structural clarity with emotional ambiguity. Okay, let's dive into this. Here are our mission parameters for today. We've got 5 key areas. First, the decay of English. Second, merchant versus soldier tongues. Third, the transliteration deception. Fourth, the Koine Greek firewall. And finally, reclaiming linguistic sovereignty. Moving right along to Section 1, the decay of English, also known as the administrative fog. So the source material views modern English not as this great tool for clear communication, but rather as an engineered fog, a fog designed to induce paralysis and maintain institutional dominance. A really core concept here is that English operates as what they call a subscription language. Basically, because we constantly rent our definitions from shifting cultural, corporate, and state entities, the texts argue that we lack a stable linguistic anchor. I mean, imagine literally leasing the thoughts in your head. They claim this induces a systemic ligation, which is essentially trapping speakers in this state of permanent spiritual and cognitive infancy, all because we don't actually own the words we use. The authors use a pretty powerful metaphor to describe this decay. They write, "The English language is a large ship that went out to sea, but through centuries of continuous drifting has become a dangerous drift to my people." It's quite poetic, right? They predict this massive linguistic vessel is eventually just going to sink under the sheer weight of its own commercial ambiguity. So how exactly does this ship sink? Well, think about how we speak every day. The text claim that English continuously collapses these really distinct high-velocity concepts into vague, singular terms. For instance, taking 4 totally different Greek concepts of love and just collapsing them into one single word, or reducing complex economic value into the simple mirage of money. According to the sources, this ambiguity creates neural drift, which constantly distances the mind from absolute unhidden reality. All right, Section 2, merchant versus soldier tongues. Let's look at these shifting paradigms. To really understand the depth of this linguistic decay, we have to contrast 2 fundamentally opposed ways of speaking and thinking. The sources draw a hard line between what they call the merchant's tongue and the soldier's tongue. Modern English is characterized as a merchant's tongue, fluid, diplomatic, and riddled with double meanings that are totally optimized for commerce, compromise, and, making a deal. Now, in total contrast, ancient Koine Greek is described as a soldier's tongue. It's this mathematically rigid, precision instrument built strictly for executing non-negotiable orders. Let's look at how this actually plays out in practice. The merchant's tongue views relationships as a syntheke. That translates to a bilateral contract based on conditions, negotiations, and swapping favors. But the soldier's tongue, it uses diatheke. The text passionately describe this as an unbreakable, unilateral covenant established by a superior to an heir. It's absolutely not a transaction. It's an absolute structural reality. Which brings us to Section 3, the transliteration deception, translating the code. Now, what's really interesting about this is how this massive shift from structural reality to emotional ambiguity actually happened. The authors point to a mechanism they call linguistic sabotage and transliteration chicanery, specifically happening within modern religious institutions. The text performed this really fascinating forensic audit of modern dynamic translations just to prove this point. For example, changing the formal Greek syntax of the fidelity of Christ to the dynamic faith in Christ. They argue this shifts the focus entirely from an objective, battle-tested execution to just a subjective human emotion. Similarly, translating Romans 12 as "don't let the world squeeze you" completely softens a strict military command about structural non-alignment into what amounts to a mere warning against peer pressure. The vocabulary itself gets audited too. The authors argue the English word church is a synthetic graft. It originally meant a physical building, but they claim it replaced the raw, militant reality of the Greek word ekklesia, which historically meant a self-governing, political and military assembly of free citizens called out to execute governance and defend territory. Completely different vibe, right? But perhaps their most provocative example is the word Christ. The texts point out that grammatically, the Greek word Christos is actually an adjective. It means the anointed, denoting a very specific status of empowerment. By turning it into a proper noun, basically a religious last name, they claim institutions have domesticated a high-velocity military title into passive, what they refer to as fairy dust theology. Let's move to Section 4, the Koineia Greek firewall, the unhackable source code. So, what is the countermeasure to all this administrative fog? Well, for the authors of these texts, the solution is pretty radical. They propose abandoning the linguistic compromises of the merchant's tongue entirely and just fully embracing the structural mechanics of ancient Koine Greek. They view Koine Greek as this unhackable firewall for the mind, primarily because of its mathematical precision. Think about it. Every noun has a fixed legal address through its case system. It's literally like GPS coordinates for a word, leaving absolutely no room for semantic drift. It also uses the middle voice to describe self-sufficient action, and it utilizes the aorist tense to issue these non-negotiable sudden flash commands. This distinction is absolutely crucial. The text highlights that while English is totally obsessed with when an action occurs, Greek focuses on how it occurs, its aspect. The Greek aorist aspect doesn't give you some blurry, fluid timeline. Instead, it provides a definitive snapshot of a completed, eternal reality. It presents truth as a hardened event, definitely not a suggestion to be negotiated over. The philosophical stakes here are incredibly high for the authors. They strongly contrast mainstream institutional religion, which they actually derisively call the hog pen, against this rigid, militant linguistic framework. Here's a quote. "The hog pen teaches you to worship your own weakness. The logos commands you to execute the maturity mandate." Almost done. Section 5, Reclaiming Linguistic Sovereignty, also known as Operation Telos. And this brilliantly illustrates how the authors believe adopting this specific operating system actually transforms the individual. It takes you from a passive participant into an active sovereign. Take their decoding of the command to be perfect, for example. The sources argue that institutional definitions frame perfection as a 100% sinless, static moral state, basically an impossible standard that just keeps people dependent. But the Greek word teleios actually means functional completion and mission readiness. So it's not about never making a mistake, it's a tactical mandate to reach your full operational maturity. Now, to actually reach this maturity, the texts prescribe establishing what they call a linguistic air gap. This involves 3 very strict steps. First, you have to entirely purge your vocabulary of the fluid, compromising merchant's gloss. Second, anchor your mind firmly in the mathematically rigid syntax of Koine Greek. And third, through disciplined repetition, you physically overwrite the corrupted neural pathways established by modern English. Look, it's a rigorous, totally uncompromising framework that challenges the very foundation of how we communicate. As we wrap up this explainer, I'll leave you with the ultimate question posed by the source material. Take a really hard look at the words you use every day to define your reality. Are you speaking a language of subscription, or are you speaking a language of sovereignty?